Hello, and welcome back for the final panel discussion at MUSE Meets 2022. I'm Kelley Squazzo, Director of Publisher Relations and Content Development at Project MUSE. We are very excited to bring together this next group of speakers to talk about the future of humanities scholarship. One of the biggest challenges our society faces in the wake of the pandemic is how to combat misinformation and distrust in expertise. Humanities disciplines must play an even more critical and timely role in helping change behavior and influencing humanity to do the right thing. To paraphrase Karen Wolf, who gave such a fantastic keynote yesterday, the humanities are not just a subject. There are endless significant and critical topics in the humanities, but they are also a mode of inquiry and thought. They provide us with the way to be human together. As stakeholders in the humanities, librarians, publishers, scholars, instructors, and students, we need to explore new directions for a future that is innovative, reflects today's research, and has potential for a greater impact on the world. This panel of experts from across the humanities ecosystem will address three big picture topics about the humanities scholarship. First, we'll talk about the current state of the humanities, especially in the wake of the pandemic. Second, we'll define exactly what we mean by digital humanities and how humanities curricula and publications are evolving and embracing technology. And finally, we'll share our thoughts on the future of the discipline. Equally important, we want to answer your questions, hear about your curiosities, and brainstorm thoughts together. So we'll have plenty of time for audience questions toward the end of the hour. So please be sure to type them into the Q&A module as you think of them. Let's get started with a brief introduction of our panelists. If you want to learn more, their complete and impressive bios can be found on the MUSE Meets webpage. Arthur Levine is Distinguished Scholar of Higher Education at New York University. He is also President Emeritus of Teachers College, Columbia University, and President Emeritus of the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, now the Institute on Citizens and Scholars. Allison Levy.
Good to be with you.
Thank you. Allison Levy is Digital Scholarship Editor for Brown University's Digital Publications Initiative, generously launched with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and with further support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Tom Lippincott is the Director of the Center for Digital Humanities and Assistant Professor with joint appointments in the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute, the Department of Computer Science, and the Center for Language and Speech Processing at Johns Hopkins University. Lisa Marie Rhodey serves as Deputy Director of Digital Initiatives at the CUNY Graduate Center and holds faculty appointments in multiple programs, including Liberal Studies, Digital Humanities, Data Analysis and Visualization, and Interactive Technology and Pedagogy.
Hi, nice to join you.
We'd like to open our discussion with a focus on the present state of the humanities. January 2022 data from the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center provides a somber final tally of total college enrollment in fall of 2021. It dropped 2.7% from a year earlier, a decline of almost 500,000 students. Data from the center also show that enrollment fell in each of the 5 largest undergraduate majors at four-year colleges: business, health, liberal arts, biology, and engineering. Liberal arts, down 7.6%, declined the most. Humanities departments face stiff competition to STEM majors for reasons such as job opportunities, disinterest in the curriculum, and perhaps lack of innovation in the field itself. As we move into a post-pandemic world, what is the current state of humanities education and scholarship from your vantage points? Arthur, would you like to share your thoughts first to kick us off?
I'd be glad to. What the pandemic brought, in addition to the things that happened in higher education, was the creation of an enormous number of new content producers and distributors that entered the higher education marketplace. Let me give a quick example. Coursera. Coursera, while our enrollments were falling, Coursera's enrollments during the pandemic rose from 57 to 83 million. That increase is bigger than the whole population of higher education. And what they're offering are courses from top universities, top cultural institutions, and leading corporations. What they're offering is 24/7, any place, unbundled, individualized, online, lower cost, $49 a month, certificate programs for the most part, though they also offer degrees. As we look at this world, one of the distinctions that doesn't make any sense to me, given our competitors, is the belief that the humanities and vocational education are substantially different. And what I'd say is digital and analog Students have always come to higher education for career preparation. If you look at the medieval universities, why did they study the trivium and quadrivium? Because you get a great job in the church. Why did Harvard teach, when it first started in 1642, why did it teach Bible, Hebrew, Latin, Greek, Syriac? The reason is they were training church leaders. It was the Kennedy School. It's always been pragmatic, and higher education, the humanities in particular, have always been most successful when they've had one foot in the library, human heritage, and one foot in the street, which is the real world. And what happens when the world changes quickly, as it does now, is that the humanities and higher education in general lose traction with the street. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And for those of you working with students, what particular challenges are you facing? Maybe Tom and Lisa, you might want to speak to this as well.
Sure. So first of all, I agree very much with what Arthur just said, that I think that there is a rather artificial division right now between a choice that is being forced on students when it comes to things like choosing a major. And that doesn't work very well, particularly when you have the level of specialization that we have these days between the different disciplines, and the fact that for a lot of STEM fields, specializing is just what you do to get a job in the first place, whereas in the humanities, it really limits a lot of the things that you're going to be able to pursue afterwards. So I strongly agree on that. And I think that I'm seeing that right now with the students that I work with. So most of the students that I interact with on a day-to-day basis are graduate students in the humanities, English, history, classics, who are often in their final year of writing up their dissertation and looking at the landscape of what they're going to be doing afterwards, and what sort of support network they have, what sort of fallbacks they have. And I think that this has pre-existed the pandemic. I mean, it certainly has been an issue for quite some time. The pandemic, I think, has certainly exacerbated this and maybe sped up the fault lines between the different disciplines. I think that maybe at this point it's a band-aid to be trying to broaden the horizons of students who are that late in their scholarship, in their studies. I think that a lot of the one of the most important things that we can do is move some of the pedagogical material that is broader and that exposes them to other fields, other methodologies, other disciplines as early as possible in the curriculum. But I think that there's going to be a lot of pushback in some cases from faculty, from departments who really want their students to be absolutely laser focused on what their domain is right in front of them. So I think that that's something that we need to negotiate going forward, and that extends to undergraduates as well, where I think that there is this a trend towards forcing people into making a decision that they can't really back out of, they can't really hedge against. Where they're either going to be in this domain or that domain, when really that's not what a liberal arts education should be. It should be something where you are getting that very broad exposure in the first couple of years in a way that lets you make those informed decisions in a way that aligns with your longer term interests. So I think that there's a lot to untangle there, but I don't think that it's insurmountable. And I think the pandemic is making it more urgent.
Yes, I'll jump in at this point and say, so I work with master's and doctoral students at the Graduate Center for the City University of New York. And those students are both doctoral and master's students, and also largely the adjunct labor that teach more than 2,500 courses across the 25 campuses of the CUNY system. And so one of the things that we have really been contending with over the course of COVID, has been the move of humanities instructors to online environments and really amplifying kind of development of open educational resources. And so our students are taking a lot of care in terms of thinking about how they produce humanities content and how they share it with students, how the online publication environment impacts the way in which students engage with material. And, I think that if there's something to say, largely about the future that we're heading in, this sort of small bonus that higher education, I think, will experience as a result of having to move so much education online is that even as we move back into the classroom, the materials that we have been produced for pedagogical purposes are more sustainable, they are more thorough, and they offer more sort of robust support for student engagement because they've had to kind of manage the everything online for a while. So being able to integrate those resources back into a face-to-face instruction format, I think is going to be beneficial for undergraduate students and for graduate students. Mm-hmm. Another challenge my students are facing is purely their own inability to get into archives. And so what we've been working on is learning how to access archival materials remotely. And so students have been really responsive to opportunities to learn computational skills in order to access and evaluate online resources before they are able to make those sort of very necessary personal visits to archival collections. And I think that experience has given them a real respect for the archival practices that their partners at different cultural history, cultural heritage institutions have been doing for a very long time. And they're starting to have to understand those practices a little bit better in order to make use of them. So I'll stop there for now.
That's great. Anyone else have anything to add about that? So thinking about like a broader focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the world, what more can we do as a community to not just enable students, but perhaps even a general public to engage more with humanities scholarship now? And Allison, I think you wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, thanks, Kelley. I think first, scholarship needs to be accessible, and certainly with more and digital scholarly publications, we have the potential for global reach, which we're seeing, which is incredible. We're reaching specialist and non-specialist audiences. And so I think also the promotion of the co-production of knowledge, so bringing diverse voices and perspectives into content creation is really going to be critical going forward. So connecting communities with content and vice versa. I'll give an example of a new partnership between Brown Library and the MIT Press. This is for a multimodal book series called On Seeing, which is devoted to expanding visual literacy for multiple publics. And that will be done through jargon-free writing, downloadable community engagement toolkits. So I think that the participatory nature of humanities scholarship is very much the future and the way that we can engage general readers as well as scholars.
That's great. Anything else on the current state of the humanities anyone would like to add before we jump into our next topic?
Could I talk a little about DEI for just a moment?
Yes, please.
And say that it's an incredibly fuzzy term that's easy to hide behind. Years ago, I did a study when it was just D. And I asked college presidents and professors on campuses whether they thought it was important. They said, yes, it's very important. And I'd say, could you define it? Then I'd watch them babble because they didn't know what it meant to them, to their campus. And then I'd ask, do you have a plan? No. What's going to be critical, if any discipline, if the humanities expect to respond to DEI, we really need to define it, we really need to plan for it, and we really need to fund it.
Absolutely. Anyone else want to comment on that? Okay.
Moving in a slightly different direction than DEI, but thinking about the public-facing nature of the humanities. As that despite the fact that we see enrollments dropping in humanities programs, I think that we are actually in the midst of a kind of renaissance in terms of interest in humanities content. And I'm going to appeal to the slightly more popular culture sort of phenomena that we see going on. But, let's take, for example, the Marvel universe. There are people who are deeply interested in public engagement and conversations about comics. You see entire sort of conversation boards on Reddit and other places talking about, transmedia narratives, weaving together video games and print publications and audio, video, texts. And so I think that part of our challenge is that we are still sort of stuck in a kind of classroom orientation toward what we mean by humanities content. And that what we need to be a little bit more open to are the less conventional kinds of conversations that can then actually bring us into maybe what we might recognize as more traditional humanities discussions. And this comes to light, I think, in my own practices where, we see on a regular basis, for example, conversations about equity, about representation, about social justice in terms of technology. Kelley, you mentioned this at the beginning in terms of mis and disinformation. This is a common, very widespread point of discussion. And I think that it behooves us in the humanities to somehow relinquish our responsibility to really having conversations about the role of social media, the role of viral text sharing, about memes, about things like this, which have always been a part of humanities research and learning. And that we need to really think about how we're going to reframe and sort of adapt for the current sort of hunger that there is for reconciling humanities inquiry with the technological explosions that are going on today.
That's great. That's a lot of food for thought and a fantastic segue to our second topic. So let's move on and shift a little bit more towards a focus on innovation and a little bit about the field of digital humanities and computational social science. So a May 2020 Inside Higher Ed article discussing a new report from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences noted that less than 20% of departments offered a seminar in digital methods, and only about a quarter had a faculty specializing in digital humanities. So we know Project MUSE, we're an aggregator of traditional containers of book and journal content, but we're also expanding to work with publishers and by proxy scholars to develop and host dynamic multimodal content. I know university presses like Stanford and University of Virginia have really embraced that daunting task of creating workflows and peer review processes for digital humanities projects, which, let me tell you, is very different than the print world. From university press and library perspectives, it kind of seems like this field is growing and evolving. So to start off, and since we've got such a diverse audience today of publishers and librarians and scholars and students, and a panel with very varying perspectives, so let's define exactly what we mean by the term digital humanities. And of course, we'd love to hear from the audience in kind of an informal poll. So feel free to type your definition of digital humanities into the Q&A. It could be really fun to compile that later. So let's each just kind of take our own turn and just give our thoughts on what we mean by that term in that vernacular. Who'd like to start?
I think you had asked me to start on this, and I'm happy to, but I will begin with a cop-out, which is to say that, within the field of digital humanities, assuming that one wants to call it a field, which there's also discussions about, there's as many definitions of what digital humanities is. Are there people who like to practice it? But I'm going to try to go for the most broad here and then talk about the fact that when, for example, I'm editing a collection on feminist digital humanities, and we were very careful because those are two terms for which it is very difficult to offer definitions. And we encourage each of our authors to define the term for themselves. But we do so with the sort of overarching charge that digital humanities is about bringing humanistic inquiry. And I'm going to go back to that definition that Kelley offered at the beginning of humanities as a mode of inquiry and thought, and bringing that to the practice of digital technologies. So in many cases, it can be use of digital technologies to activate or to put into practice humanistic inquiry. In other cases, it's about bringing humanistic inquiry to bear on existing technologies as they're used in at many of the places in which they have become ubiquitous for, interacting with text and image and human interaction.
That's great. Tom, what your perspective from where you sit in your roles at Hopkins? What are your thoughts on this?
Sure. So I think my perspective is going to be a little more specific, I guess, than many others on this panel. So to me, the research aspect. So as a researcher, I focus mostly on what would be considered the novel applications of computational intelligence to traditional humanistic inquiry. And in that respect, we're mostly talking about things in the realm of machine learning, artificial intelligence, whatever you want to call it. And a lot of the scholarship lies in exploring the relationship between how human intelligence, so to speak, approaches these things, and what strengths and weaknesses we have in terms of things like bias or our capacity for processing many primary sources, or having an even-handed representation of what we have consumed, say over time, and comparing that to what computational intelligence brings to the table, and in fact enables things that were not possible before. And so this is in my mind in contrast to what I think is probably 95% of what is branded as digital humanities, which is usually looking either as technology as a service, something that is being kind of applied off the shelf, or something that is being some sort of technology transfer, or as a mode of dissemination and interaction, which is kind of what you get in public humanities. And I would say that the numbers that you cited earlier, of saying that I think 20% of departments having a faculty who identifies as in that area, I would say that the numbers of people who are actually doing what I would consider computational humanistic research are minuscule even compared to that. I would say it's more like maybe 1%. I think that it's very small, and that's because you really do need to have a background in both fields to be, or at least kind of an understanding of general humanistic inquiry, and an understanding of the computational methodologies involved and how they can be developed further, and what would count as research, say in a computer science department, before you can really start to see the combinatorial possibilities of bringing these things to bear, and then really understand. And we've seen this a lot recently in popular press, but in a lot of humanistic journals, a lot of humanistic publications that have come out against digital humanities are attacking what is very much a misunderstanding, I think, of at least the little corner of digital humanities that I'm calling computational intelligence. And so, to me, that's where the most intellectual substance of that I'm interested in, at least, comes into play.
That's great. Allison and Arthur. I mean, Allison, I know you're working firsthand on projects, and Arthur, you might be a little more removed, but it still would be very interesting to hear your perspectives on a definition and how.
Sure. So I can speak more specifically to scholarly publishing and the affordances that digital humanities tools and methodologies bring to that content, opening up entirely new ways, exciting ways for authors to think about not just the presentation of their material, but the formulation of ideas, the articulation of scholarly arguments, how all of that can be very different in a digital publication. And again, by relying on all that we've learned from our digital humanities colleagues and experts. So there's a lot of exciting work happening. I think the new scholarly forms support these interpretations, again, that are driven by all of the DH advances and new approaches that it brings.
Anyone else have anything to add?
I don't have much to add. What I'd say is digital for us is a new frontier. In most colleges and universities, when we have our digital natives who are attending them, we have digital immigrants who are teaching those natives, and we have analog universities for the most part. And what we're going to witness is this extraordinary explosion, and describe what's going to come is enormously difficult. And for example, imagine we'll be able to take, in addition to reading at Pericles, we'll be able to take, using virtual reality, student to 5th century Athens and see Pericles in the world that he lived in. All kinds of things are going to open up in terms of instruction, scholarship in our world. The coming advent of big data, VR, AR, hasn't even scratched the surface yet.
Like, can I follow up and sort of talk a little bit about some of the sort of missing spaces I think that we have in our conversation? And I'm gonna dovetail on something Arthur was talking about earlier, which is really understanding and being able to put into practice diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that this is one of the challenges that one of the critiques that has been probably most acutely between 2010 and 2015 levied towards the field of digital humanities. And it's that it's not a very inclusive space. And I think that in large part has been cultivated by this sense that you need to be an expert in technology in order to participate. And so what I've seen in the field of digital humanities is a real attempt to counter those perceptions and the practiced reality of the lack of diversity through various programs and different kinds of ways of imagining participation within the field. So some of the things that we haven't talked about, for example, are the creation of digital archive projects and digital collections. This is an activity that many of my humanities doctoral students, social science and humanistic social science students engage in. We're talking about oral history projects, not only the recording, but the indexing and the accessibility of the collection of history. And in many ways, this sonic sort of interpretation and analysis of those recordings. We have sonic analysis, which is to use sound as a means of analyzing and conveying quantities of information in archives. We also have people who do text encoding. So people who produce editions and who use text encoding practices to teach close reading practices. And that those then are used to train large data models in order to do what Arthur is sort of gesturing towards, which is big data analysis. So, I think that there's a lot of different ways that people practice the digital humanities. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about, because you brought up this article about 20% of humanities faculty having a faculty member who identifies as someone who does digital humanities. And this is one of the reasons why I have an NEH project called the Digital Humanities Research Institute. And I think, honestly, that one of these, that this has a lot to do with the way that we have addressed professional development within the humanities as a whole. And oftentimes what we do is we create this sort of sites of excellence model, which means that anybody who would like to learn how to do digital humanities work, who would like to integrate technology into their research and teaching, has to leave their home institutional context, travel elsewhere, receive a certain amount of training, go back to their home institution, and then somehow get that integrated into their everyday, already overworked and over busy schedule. So the model that we're taking on, and I'll drop a link into the chat for the Digital Humanities Research Institute, is we've decided to try and create a community-driven and grassroots training methodology, so that we offer a 1 week curriculum on core computational skills. And we feel like this is in large part because many of the people who are active researchers in the humanities are people who shied away from technology use for a reason, either because they didn't feel like because of their situatedness, they didn't relate to being someone who was a techie, or they didn't feel like that was a field where they felt welcome. And so what we've done is we've used humanistic, critical pedagogic approaches to try to demystify core technology concepts, to build up foundational understanding for faculty so that they can become more confident autodidacts in technology practices. So we teach them things like how to work from the command line, how to do data sharing, what data is. We teach them some early programming languages, and we teach them how to use Omeka. We teach them a little bit about mapping. But what we really try to do is provide some of that foundational knowledge about what technology is and how that technology applies to their humanistic area of inquiry. And what we've discovered is that that method is really starting to work. We've now seen over 500 people who have taken courses in professional development in digital humanities as a result. And so I think that as we embrace approaches like this that really consider the on-the-ground needs and the realities and the exigencies of the scholars in the field, that we're going to better be able to prepare scholars to do the work that we know is so necessary in their programs.
Yeah, that's such a great program. And I'll just piggyback right on that, because Brown is offering an NEH Institute this summer, which sort of in many ways builds upon, what Lisa and Matt have done. So we're focused on the interpretation part and increasing diversity in the practice and the production of the scholarship. So this is an author-centric institute. It focuses on career realities. It attempts to demystify and streamline the process of creating a digital publication. So, and this is specifically for scholars from under-resourced institutions where they don't have a Center for Digital Scholarship at their home institute and may not be able to participate in Lisa's wonderful institute, still need that foundational knowledge. But again, for us, focused on advancing their projects, shortening the time to contract, getting the work into, getting the interest and the attention of acquisitions editors. So half of the faculty is made up of editors at presses who are publishing, actively publishing, or have expressed interest in growing their digital portfolio. So I think this really practical approach to supporting those scholars who most need it is a big step in the right direction. And the more such programs, training workshops we can have, the better.
I just wanted to follow up a little bit on Lisa's comments, which I think I agree with very much. So I agree that the kind of Zarathustrian model of someone going off and coming back with the arcane knowledge to be able to do something new, outside of their home field, outside of their kind of immediate surroundings is not it's not great. And so, I push pretty hard to have our own Center for Digital Humanities located smack dab in the middle of the humanistic departments themselves. We have art history on one side and Near Eastern studies on the other, so that we can actually offer courses that are right there, that won't really that don't involve going over to the engineering side of campus or anything like that. I do think that's important, and it also connects to what I wanted to kind of clarify, that when I was talking about having the kind of computational knowledge, I wasn't thinking of that so much as a hurdle for student collaborations or for collaborations across or the use of digital technology or anything like that. I was thinking more about the ability to produce research that pushes forward both the computational fields and the humanistic fields in tandem, because they both have unique things to offer one another in terms of, like, say, use cases. You know, humanities are exceptionally challenging in pretty much any way you define a research task within them. And computation is just getting to the point where it might be even possible to even scratch the surface of that, but it needs that kind of engagement to actually push forward that field as well. And so I think that the idea of demystifying, which is, I think that word has been repeated a few times here for very good reason, because I think that once you get past that threshold of kind of it looking like arcane knowledge to an outsider, you can find ways to translate humanistic inquiry into computation and vice versa. In fact, there are many people who have been doing this, at least in computational linguistics, for quite a long time and are fairly adept at it. It's just that they're mostly siloed in computer science departments and linguistics departments right now, and don't have that kind of interaction. And there is this kind of, there are these border cases in the application. I shouldn't even call them border cases because they happen disturbingly frequently, where a method is applied without sufficient understanding of it, and the conclusions are propagated through publication, and those conclusions are not really based on the appropriate application of the methodology itself, and it just dissuades other people from getting involved. I think that for example, the example that Lisa had of measuring the information content of, say, an audio database of audio. An audio corpora would be a really good example, because I imagine that is a fairly sophisticated mathematical construct that is measuring entropy or something of that data set and saying this is how much information is in it based on the volume changes and things like that. But that's going to be a black box, kind of a sledgehammer that is just going to be used to make a humanistic point, until you have people who are able to translate across that boundary intelligibly and actually understand what the implications of measuring things in that particular way is. So I do think it's still important to have people who are able to move between those two worlds comfortably. I think they will always be the minority. I think but they're important people to have someone like that in the room, I think, for research conversations.
That's an interesting case, and yes, it probably will be that way for quite a while. But I'll just point to, so the course that I teach at the Graduate Center is called Feminist Text Analysis, and it is designed to really hone the skills of those scholars who can be sort of at this in-between space between being really a sort of machine learning expert and somebody who is trained in reading practices in the humanities. And so in this course, for example, we spend 3 weeks really kind of wrapping our heads around, I'm out of an English program, so I take this from a very sort of literary studies perspective. I want to just acknowledge that there are other ways in which in the fields of history or in social science or in anthropology, you might take a very different approach. But for example, I look at the history of what we mean by reading, and looking at the history of close reading, look at the idea of what we mean in feminism by reading against the grain. And then we take that idea of reading against the grain and we look at different forms of text analysis. For example, stylistic analysis, sentiment analysis, author attribution, TF-IDF, which is really just about collecting texts and putting them in categorizations using machine learning. And we go through a 5-step process of looking at, for example, how it is that we collect and clean and prepare data, looking at how we create questions, looking at how we measure texts and what are the different methodologies for measuring and quantifying text. What are the different ways in which we operationalize our questions? And then how do we analyze our results? And so while what we do is we basically set up these sort of notebooks for students, so they're not actually having to do all of the Python programming, but they are learning along the way. And what I think one of the things is that we really need to learn how to get comfortable with teaching and with training students in is how to move comfortably between these two worlds. And I think it's really essential for the future of the humanities to be able to think about the idea of interacting with technology as a way of reading against the grain of that technology, even if it is to some degree a black box, understanding how you can look at the analysis and look at the questions and read against and think about the ways in which that technology's biases and assumptions are sort of preparing it for the kinds of results that you get. And I think that this is something that we are entirely capable of doing if we just raise sort of the level of awareness among faculty just even a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of isomorphism really between what humanists are doing and a lot of the things that are available to them and that are being developed on the computational side of things. It's just there's no standard translation book between these things, and a lot of that space is kind of dominated, I think, right now by more like rhetorical back and forth and attempts to talk about why things can't work or why they aren't working and so forth. When I think that there really is a lot of there's more similarity than I think a lot of people would expect when you look at human and computational intelligence, or at least there are ways to translate between them that can be very fruitful. But it does take that book has not been written yet. So
take note, publishers that are listening.
Also, in terms of translating, I think one of the questions that you wanted to ask us was about credibility, right, of a monograph. And what is credibility? How do we establish that? And our, obviously the way we do this historically is through reader reports and through peer review. And my sense is that, one of the things we need to do is to bolster researchers and pedagogues' comfortableness with evaluation. It's something that I've found to be sort of startling in terms of the readiness with which humanities faculty seem ready to sort of relinquish their ability to assess the scholarship of peers who use different methodologies within their field. And I think that that's really a matter of confidence, and that what we can do is actually address a kind of threshold level of what I keep calling sort of computational literacy among humanities faculty that really can promote our comfortableness and our ability to increase the number of readers, peer reviewers, and people who can help kind of clear up the pipelines. And I'm sure Allison can speak much more to this.
I'm happy to. A big topic, but a really important one is rethinking peer review for, in our case, we're producing born digital enhanced monographs. And, it's a different set of questions that have to be asked. There's still some of those same questions, the tried and true ones, but a whole new set of considerations around the user experience, intuitiveness, design, the integration of form and content, et cetera. And we've now gone through 3 peer reviews with 3 different presses, and it's been deeply collaborative in a great way, thinking together about how best to prepare a set of guidelines that will result in productive criticism, but also identifying the readers who are ready for this kind of work, are helping them to be ready. So that is rapidly evolving. I think also in terms of validation, it's important to think about the tenure and promotion reviews at the institutional levels, and there too, we need to see much more work. We're very fortunate at Brown. Our co-PI on the Mellon Grant is the Dean of the Faculty. So those conversations began at our university in 2015. And so that Born Digital Scholarship receives the same recognition, the same critical attention that a printed monograph would receive. But that's all The language is decided at the department level. So we do see some nuances there, even within our own institution, but we are very fortunate, our faculty is very fortunate to have this support. But I think it has to extend beyond the institution and, critical reviews in disciplinary journals. We need to see more reviews of digital scholarship and prizes and awards. And again, all of the same type of attention, again, maybe slightly nuanced, that conventional publishing formats receive. And I do believe that will happen. It's coming. I'm optimistic, but it is playing out right now. And there's more work to be done around that.
So I find it hard to imagine how a department would be convinced to take like user experience design at that level of feedback as important for something like tenure review or it's certainly not something that I'm aware of a department being willing to consider as a form of like a research artifact. But I'll let you respond to that.
Well, I think it just the kind of digital publications we're producing for our humanities faculty at Brown are multimodal, enhanced, interactive work, so that design and form are that integration is critical to the success of the project, and so those elements are reviewed. The presses want evaluations of how that's happening, what's working successfully, and so that commentary is part of the dossier, if you will, for the department. I can't speak to the individual departmental requirements for tenure and promotion, but certainly there is valuable feedback from peers, from the presses who are publishing the work, and so that's all considered.
So when I think about the peer review process, one of the big pitfalls that I've been seeing a lot of lately is that I think that faculty often don't know who to ask for feedback on computational approaches to things. So it's been pretty clear from a few fairly high profile papers that have been published in top humanities venues that these documents were shown to maybe a general statistician at some point, or they were shown to a technologist who maybe has a bachelor's in computer science. And the idea that is the level of scrutiny that you need for vetting a computational process that probably has nothing to do with the statistics department, that was probably developed entirely as deep learning or something like that. That on the one hand, and then the fact that it gets through peer review at these high profile journals without apparently someone's stopping the train and saying, we need to get somebody who is an expert in this particular thing to at least read this article before we sign off on it. And it's led to some very startling claims that are easily falsifiable, just being kind of thrown out there as though they're gospel truth. So that's been my big concern with the peer review process as it relates to the mixture of computation and the humanities at this stage. But it seems like a fairly simple thing to solve in principle. I mean, the idea of just people kind of knowing what they don't know. But
I may have misunderstood part of your question. Then let me say a little bit more. Because I didn't provide the background on our digital publications initiative, which is supported by the Mellon Foundation, and we started in 2015. So we primarily work with Brown faculty, and so we provide very robust support to faculty who want to explore these new scholarly forms. So we don't expect our faculty to come in with a DH skill set, with that knowledge base. Some of our faculty do have that. Some want to acquire that in the process, but not everyone has the time to do so or the interest. And so we provide that expertise as needed. So we are not expecting our faculty necessarily to be the architects of the integration of form and design. Some of them do take a more active role in that, but we work with designers and developers and whoever we need to produce the work. So the burden is not entirely at all on our individual faculty. Of course, they are bringing this excellent content to us. It's very collaborative work, but this is faculty-led, scholarly ideas, and we work with them to present those ideas in this digital space, in this digital environment in very innovative ways.
Peer review is a constant topic. So I think this was really, really insightful, and you guys really took it down some levels. So that was really great. I'm sure our audience really enjoyed hearing that. So I'm mindful of the time. We have a couple questions from the audience, but I also wanted to give everyone kind of a chance to kind of like some parting words on the future of humanities. So I'm going to turn it over to Arthur to start us off there, and then we'll see if we have some time for a couple questions.
I guess what I'd say is, in order to understand the future, I think we really have to look backward. And let me just talk about the humanities and the academy. 3 phases. Mm-hmm. First phase was the agrarian American economy. And what we did was, it was a teaching college. And we taught students memorization, discipline, and furniture of the mind. And what they did was they took down lectures verbatim. And they did recitation of the readings, and they did formulaic disputations. Then you move into the industrial age, and what happens is the notion of mental discipline is rejected, the Enlightenment is embraced, and scholarship is added to the agenda. We see the advent of things like seminars and graduate education, German values like Lehrfreiheit and Lernfreiheit, and the disciplines come into being. And that dominates the industrial era university. And now the question is, so what's the digital era university look like? And what digital humanities look like? And the answer is, I think my colleagues are at the cutting edge. They're going to lead digital humanities into the future. But much of it's still inchoate, as our conversation is indicated. What are the themes? Well, it's going to be global rather than national. It's going to be digital rather than analog. It's going to be interdisciplinary. It's going to be problem-based. What we can also expect is we'll see more short-term courses. We'll see more certificate programs. And in terms of scholarship, we're still working out the pieces. What does digital scholarship look like? Mm-hmm. And it raised every challenge we've been discussing this morning. And what we'll end up doing is working our way through by a pattern of experimentation, trying lots of things until we achieve a new consensus on what this means.
That's wonderful. Anyone else have any final thoughts? It's hard to follow that. Well, we've got a couple minutes left, so let's see what our audience has to say. We as publishers and librarians need to empower the powerless. That is why we are here. How can we as publishers and librarians do this through the digital humanities?
I have some opinions on this. I think that are relevant. So I think that improving and streamlining the notion of open access. I think we've certainly come a long way, and it certainly is. It's a buzzword in some ways. You know, it gets thrown into every grant proposal that comes across the desk in this area. But I'm still amazed every time that I go to try to find some humanistic data set, or something that I've heard about, something that someone is already writing a dissertation on or has written a monograph on, and find that it's buried behind several layers of kind of fancy technology. And there's no big red button there that says, here, download this data set in its most pristine and unmodified format, right? Like get as close to the primary sources as possible. And it always blows my mind because that's such a trivial thing to put up there as the starting point of building all these other fancier ways of interacting on top of it. And I guess the same thing could also go for publications themselves in secondary literature. But I mean, mainly I'm thinking about it in terms of the data itself. I think that's the only way that you get the kind of scrutiny that makes research more and more credible as more and more eyes are able to look at it and able to interact with it on their own terms without basically being curated in how you interact with it, which of course that's going to lead you to the same conclusions that the person who's curating it has already reached and that sort of thing. So I think that being maybe more simply open in the way that data is made available is actually something that I would encourage.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just add one small piece and say, we've been through this. During World War II, one of the things that happened was GIs were given thin, small copies of the classics, even books that had been popular and had died, like The Great Gatsby, and it caused a resurgence. The secret was making this compelling. The way people who embrace digital humanities, who we're trying to bring in, is making it compelling, making it something they really want, not something we're foisting upon them.
Mm-hmm. Great.
I might just add one way that we're bringing readers into the process, which again, digital tools enable us to do, is to have nonlinear reader-driven navigation. So our works are, they're digital monographs, they're 80,000 words, a lot of text to move through, but by offering these different pathways into the material, determined by the reader, what interests them now, maybe having some signposts, some prompts, but really letting them move into this space and engage with that knowledge on their own terms has been very successful. I think there's still so much more that can be done there. It's very exciting. And again, it's another form of access to knowledge.
I want to agree with that very, very much. I think that there's a whole potential industry of almost rewriting or writing maybe like condensed forms or accessible forms of windows into like research. I see that particularly in computational sciences. Like I really wish there was a pipeline where say the original scholars or the original researchers on the computational side would collaborate with someone, an intermediary who would help them translate their technical findings into something that would kind of explain why a humanist should care about this, why it might be useful for them, and just have like a repository of that kind of material that tracks the rapid pace of machine learning research. I think that'd be wonderful. So, those windows are just tremendously valuable.
I think I might approach the question a little bit differently, and I think my reaction is a little bit against the framing of the question in the way in which I think we talk about making things so that people who are powerless have some sort of agency. And I believe that constructing the problem that way places what is a systemic problem in the realm of individual responsibility. And so I want to kind of turn that back on its ear and say that the way that librarians and publishers and people in positions to change systemic processes is to act as allies in sort of reworking those systems in ways that are promote and recognize the sort of historic powerlessness of many people in academia. And I think that we can see that in digital humanities in terms of really trying to push against things like, enterprise level technology solutions for things like learning platforms, things that harvest student data and sell them to, frankly, to Wall Street, for the use of creating financial objects and systems, that we not give into systems like turnitin.com or other forms of proctoring or surveillance software, that instead we really, really commit ourselves to the integrity of student identity and the protection and sort of reconsideration of what we mean by public and private data. And that we, as people who are in positions that are decision-making, that are structuring systems, that allow, that put enterprise solutions in place, that we are serving as allies by making sure that we are not kind of conceding to the sort of proprietary industries that want to make use of our students, make use of their data to monetize their work, and instead really support the opportunities and the places where they can flourish without feeling preyed upon in order to do their work. So it'd be mine.
Wow, guys, this was an amazing discussion. I apologize to the questions from the audience we couldn't get to. I'll make sure I send them to you guys so you can see what people were asking. But I really do thank you so much, Arthur and Allison and Tom and Lisa, for your generosity and giving your time today to give your perspectives to this compelling and complicated topic. So I hope our audience learned a lot. I know I certainly did. And thank you to our audience for joining us today and your great questions. I hope you really did find this discussion as engaging and inspiring as I did. All of us at Project MUSE look forward to continuing these conversations with our partners in the greater scholarly publishing community. If you missed any of the live sessions of MUSE Meets, don't worry, you can view them on the Project MUSE YouTube channel. We'll send the links after the event and they will be accessible for all. So that concludes our live stream programming for MUSE Meets 2022. Thank you so much for spending part of your week with us. We're going to take a 45-minute break. We hope to meet many of you at the 2 networking sessions this afternoon on sales and marketing and humanities and technology. Just look for the Zoom link on the MUSE Meets webpage and click to join. Have a great rest of your day.